In this video we're going to be looking at how you can make a very simple jig for your table saw, which is going to allow you to cut these perfect single blade finger joints every single time. So the very first stage is to get yourself a bit of wood which is going to form the back fence of your jig. So I'm just using a piece of 13mm ply for this, just a kind of scrap piece I've had lying around. Then the first thing we want to do is kind of centre it in on the back fence of your crosscut sled. And what we're going to do is make just one blade's width cut in this, and I'm going to set my blade about 1 centimetre high. Okay, so now you can see we've got one blade's width slot cut in the bottom of our jig. So now that we've cut that slot, which is exactly one blade's width, what we need to do is create a pin which is going to stick in there. So a couple of different things you can do. You could either cut a very thin piece of wood which would be able to be glued in there, so that would be the exact same width as your blade. Or what I've done is I've actually been able to find a piece of sheet metal which I had lying around, and I've actually cut a pin out of that. The sheet metal I've had is 3mm thick. The width of my blade is exactly 3mm thick, so this is going to work perfectly for me. So you can see that slots really nice and tight into that little groove that I've made in the jig. Okay, so what we're going to do now is glue that in place. When we glue it in place, we want it flush with the bottom of your jig and also flush with the back as well. Okay, so with our pin now glued in place, I'm just going to wait on that to dry. So with the glue dried and the pin secured firmly in place, that's the construction of our jig finished. So now we will look at how it actually works. So there are two main points to take into consideration when we're setting up our jig for cutting single blade finger joints. The first main point is the distance your pin is away from your blade. So we want to position our jig so that this pin is exactly one blade's width away from the blade. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is to take another piece of the sheet metal, the exact same stuff that I used to make my pin, place that beside my pin, and then slide that up against my blade. And what that's doing is setting up my jig at exactly one blade's width away from my blade. So now I can take that out and then clamp my jig to the back fence of my crosscut sled. And that should be my jig in the exact place we need to make these single blade finger joints. So the next important piece of setup to do is to set your blade at the correct height. The correct height should be just about a hair's breadth taller than the thickness of the workpiece that you're going to be using. So you can see here my blade is too low, so I'm just going to raise that up until the top of the blade is just sitting proud of the thickness of my workpiece. Okay, and that looks good. Right. Okay, so with the jig set up in the correct position and the blade in our table saw set to the correct height, it's time to start cutting our finger joints. So the first thing we need to do is to take our workpiece and push it up against the pin, and then we will make our first cut. So now that we've made our first cut, we can see we've got our first finger in our first slot. So what we'll do now is put that slot over the pin. So with that slot sitting over our pin, we will now make our second cut. So you can see now we've got two fingers and two slots. So we'll now put that second slot that we've just cut over the pin and make our third cut. And now we want to repeat that process all the way along our workpiece. And that is our first piece cut. You can see all the fingers and slots that we've cut there. So now we'll move on to the second workpiece. So when we cut the second workpiece, you can see the very first thing that we did on the first workpiece was a finger. So that means in order for the second workpiece to join onto that, the first thing we need to do is cut a slot on this end of the second workpiece. So in order to do that, what we'll do is take our first workpiece, turn it over so the very first finger that we've cut, very first slot goes over the pin, and then we push our second workpiece up against that. That means that we are going to get a slot on the very first edge of our second workpiece, and we'll make that cut now. So you can see in our second workpiece, by positioning it correctly, we've now got a slot on the first edge. So now we'll take our first workpiece away, and as before we'll put that slot up against the pin and make our second cut. So now you can see we've got our first two slots and our first finger. And now we'll just repeat what we did with the first workpiece, putting that slot over the pin, making our cut, and then repeating the process all the way up the workpiece. And there we have our second workpiece now finished. So now that we've finished cutting our two workpieces, these should slot together really nicely and give us a very nice finger joint. So there we go, we've got that right first time. So if you remember back to when we set the height of the blade, we set the height of the blade just very slightly proud of the thickness of our workpiece. So what that does, or what you'll notice, is that your fingers are just sitting slightly proud of the surface of your workpiece. And what that does is it just allows you a little bit of room for sanding them down and getting them nice and smooth. So just a little bit of troubleshooting for you. If you find that when you go to slot your finger joints together that they're too tight and they don't slot together easily, then it means your pin is too far away from the blade. You can just move your jig very slightly closer to the blade and that should help the problem. If you find that your finger joints are too loose, so there's no friction holding them together, then it means your pin on your jig is too close to the blade, so then you just need to move your jig very more slightly away from your blade and that should solve that problem. So I hope you enjoyed watching the construction of this single blade box joint jig and the demonstration of how to use it. A real simple and easy solution to get really nice decorative 90-degree joints in your workpieces. So if you found this video useful, don't forget to click like and please subscribe to my channel as well so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Thanks for watching.